Welcome to the But She's Your Mother podcast, where we talk about all things related to being raised by narcissistic parents. Our guests are adult survivors of child abuse. Please note that this podcast is intended for mature audiences and may feature topics such as emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, domestic violence, self-harm, suicide, murder, and eating disorders. Opinions expressed by guests and survivors are their own. Some names may be changed or blocked out to protect minors, victims, and survivors. Thank you for listening to But She's Your Mother, the podcast.
Then I turned 40. I got a phone call from him. And the phone call is him ruining my 40th birthday. My wife had done everything that she could to make me have a wonderful day. Actually, I had literally she had booked us even a massage for me. I had just gotten out of the massage, just left it. I was completely relaxed, and he called. And so anyway, so then it's kind of become like a game thing.
What was the phone call? Don't leave people hanging.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So the phone call was essentially, it was going back to the whole thing about Disney and not letting him in the hotel room. And it was basically being selfish and all this other kind of stuff. And then, he did pay for some of my college. And so then, he throws that back to my face. And I'm like, Dad, that was 20 years ago. And I said, look, I'm grateful that you did that. I said, but had I known you'd hold it over my head for 20 years, I wouldn't have accepted it.
I'm a parent. That's our literal job.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, when my brother and him didn't talk for many, many years, he decided to just stop paying child support for my brother. Just stop. Because my brother didn't talk. He didn't buy him any Christmas or birthday or, Hanukkah for him because he's Jewish. He celebrates Christmas. He wouldn't get anything from my brother, but he would get me stuff. And so it was, so I kind of just got with him, and I just said, look, I said that I was like, it's sometimes with parenthood, it's your job to provide the bare minimum, and sometimes that includes education. You didn't do anything else. Like, he likes to sit there and say he raised 3 kids. I have a half sister from his first marriage too, but he didn't raise any kids. He didn't raise any of us. So he just likes to take, like, in his mind. And yes, my mom was a big part of it, but could he have fought harder? Probably. There's nothing that you could do to keep me from seeing my daughter. Like, I would fight tooth and nail if that was the case.
Well, and also the fact that he uses, like, I paid for your college, which is, in my opinion, a parent's job, as manipulation and leverage, right? The fact that he does that, I mean, he doesn't look at doing his job as a parent actually being his job as a parent. It's something that you owe him for, and it's the thing that he uses or attempts to use as leverage. I mean, on your 40th birthday, to call you specifically, obviously, to ruin your birthday and give you anything but the love that you deserve.
Yeah. So that was a problem. So then he and I weren't, we were talking then, and then around, I was after the holidays and stuff like that. I was supposed to go down to Florida. I was going down to Florida for work for a training thing. And I was going to be in West Palm Beach County. Anyways, I was somewhere in there, and it wasn't that far because he lives in, Miami, he lives in North Miami. So I told him I was coming down there, and then he and I got into a fight. I forget over what on the phone. So I was like, I'm going to see if he calls me while I'm down here. And it's a game. I know it's a game, but he didn't. So I called my aunt up instead, and one of my aunts, and I went and had dinner with her and my cousin. I went back and never heard back from him, and I just really hadn't talked to him. So my sister also struggles with him. She has struggled. Like, okay, so when she had a baby, you know what he gave her as a present? Gym membership. Because he's very vain about it, and was worried about, is always about her weight. And so she also has 3 daughters who doesn't really have anything to do with. He did one thing where he tried to bond with them and took them to 2 of the 3 girls. Well, the third one was too young, to the UK, and they had an absolutely miserable time with him. One of them struggles with her weight, and he wouldn't let that go, which is challenging. So he wouldn't let them eat when they needed to eat, things like that, which is none of his business, and stop body shaming. So they were miserable about that. But then one of her daughters now identifies as trans. and the way he feels towards people of color and women, I'm sure you can imagine how a trans grandchild goes over with him. Although with people of color, it's kind of funny because his excuse that is that he marched for civil rights one time in the 60s, supposedly.
So then you should know better than to use the N word.
Yes, under any circumstances, you
Yeah,
know.
absolutely.
So, like, even if somebody's a piece of crap, like I think Kanye West is a piece of shit. Okay, but I wouldn't use the N word. I would just say Kanye West is a piece of shit. His skin tone has nothing to do with him being a piece of shit. He's just a piece of shit. And we judge people based on the caliber of their character, not the color of their skin, their gender, sexual orientation, or any other class, protected class, physical appearance, whatever. And so that's how he's just very, very vain about it. So going back to the very part of this, I think that part of it is his development was stunted when he was 12. And he's never really been able to get past that. I think that he lacks complete emotional empathy. For wife number 6, and they weren't technically married, but they were together for like 10, 11 years. So it was common law in Florida. Her son died unexpectedly in his 30s. And literally 2 or 3 days after that happened, I was down there when it happened, and I was supposed to go back home to Georgia, but I was worried that Deborah would commit suicide if I left because of the way he was being. So I stayed for the entire summer to help make sure she would be okay. But 2 to 3 days after her son died, he was like, "Get over it. Let's go see a movie." Shit you not. That's what he said. That is what he said. I think that he's so emotionally stunted. Like, I don't even know if he's a true narcissist as much as he is so emotionally stunted and has so much trauma that he doesn't know. He just doesn't have that. He just turns off. I've never seen the man cry ever in my entire life. And it's just, I think that's a big part of it. But one of the biggest things for me is my sister and I were working together during this time period, and I ended up sending him a letter on his birthday, and that was definitely planned. Basically saying how I feel about everything that's going on. And my sister and I saying, "Hey, we want to have a relationship with you. We love you, but things can't keep going the way they're going. And see a counselor with us, do something. Let's have this. You're getting to a point where you're turning politics into your entire life, and nobody can stand being around you." And when he would come up here and see my daughter, he couldn't put his phone down long enough with business or whatever else that is to just be with her. Little kids especially don't lie. Victoria will ask about Alyssa's parents. She'll ask about aunts and uncles. She'll ask about my sister. She never asks about my dad. If she's met him, she never asks about him ever, because he's never taken the time to make an emotional connection.
Yeah, there's nothing there, which unfortunately is a gift in this case.
I mean, the thing is, I struggle with that, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But basically, there was a line that he said in one of his letters that basically translated to, "My kids are not important enough for me to do this, to try harder." That was how at least her and I both took it. But the thing about it is, like, my mom did a lot of really cruel and really mean things. My dad doesn't. He doesn't do cruel and mean things. He's just an idiot sometimes. And he's an intelligent man. He just makes really poor decisions. He's also had COVID like 1,000 times. So I think that's affecting his brain, because he's not going to live his life in fear, Marnie. He's not going to do it. But even though he's 78 years old, and every time he gets it, he seems to get progressively worse. He seriously had it like 5 times. And anyways, he's not a bad person. Like, my mom is a bad person. He's not. Saying things like the things he says in his views, those are bad aspects of him. He was born in the 40s with parents who were literally born in the 1800s. So, so it's I'm not that I give him a pass, because I sure as hell don't. But because my grandmother doesn't use those words. She was 90 and her dad was born in 1894. She was born in 1933, so that's again more reasonable. But my grandmother doesn't do that. But so I'm not giving him a pass on it. I'm just saying that he grew up in a very different time. And so
he grew up in a different time, but if he can use TikTok, he can learn things.
I mean, he's not terrible with technology. He's not terrible.
He can, yeah. I mean, regardless of how he views the world, when he was given an opportunity to show up for his adult children who were saying, listen, we need you to come to the table. We want to do therapy with you. We want to love you. We want you to be our dad. No matter how many stupid things he does, he had it right there on a piece of paper,
Silver platter.
giving him the roadmap to repair, and he chose not to.
Yeah. I mean, that is at the end of the day, and that becomes a pride thing with him.
Yeah.
Is what he lets his pride, consume it. My sister called me the other day saying that she was struggling with it. And I said, the thing, and her name's Jamie. I said, the thing, Jamie, is that for me, I was like, he didn't really do anything negative to my daughter. I was like, with your kids, he very much has a challenge with who they are as people. One of them in particular. So, but the thing with me is it goes back to my daughter. I will protect Victoria at the cost of at all costs. It doesn't matter what it is. And so where I respect my mom a little bit more in this situation between the two of them is my mom never tried. We knew where she stood. He showed up. He's met her. He's been here. And he didn't even, for her birthday, which was in July, didn't call, didn't send a card, didn't send a gift, nothing from him on her. And I just can't. I'm not. She deserves better than that.
Yeah, and so do you, for that matter. And
well, so do I. Yeah, so do I. But
the relationships don't bring value, and they actually do the opposite of that. There's no really good reason to stay in them. DNA is not a good enough reason. A title of mom or dad or grandma or grandpa isn't a good enough reason. If that relationship isn't healthy and doesn't have value, there is no reason to be in it, because everybody can choose to be a contributor. And if somebody isn't choosing that, well, then they are choosing not to be around. What would you say, like through your life, or even maybe now, what are some of the things that you struggle with now or if you do, as a result of your upbringing and your childhood and even being no contact?
Well, a need for attention. And I will fully admit it. And fortunately, TikTok is a good outlet for that. I have 1.2 million followers. That gives me that I think is a narc tendency that I have. I know that I am not a narcissist. I know that I have empathy and I care about people, which narcissists don't. But I do have, when you grow up in that environment, you do have the tendencies. On top of that, I was bullied as a kid in school. I came home and I thought I had a safer place, which maybe it was safer than school, but it wasn't really a safe place. And so I think that a lot of it too is a need to be accepted, and TikTok does help me with that. I think that that's part of it. I think that I overindulged my child because of it, giving her all the things that I wish I had, up to and including toys from that era. So like we've gotten my daughter obsessed with Cabbage Patch Kids. So like she loves them. We have I don't know where you're located, but we actually took her into Georgia to Babyland General Hospital to let her get her Cabbage Patch doll from there, one of them. And it's just, we buy them because we like them too. And it's just, it's things like that, I guess. I think that as far as actual struggles, it sucks not having, parents. And for a long time, there's been a stigma about being no contact with a family, because I've heard and seen your videos, but she's your mom, but he's your dad. You only get one mom, you only get one dad. Well, you know what? They chose to have us. We didn't.
I'm always like, yeah, thanks for the reminder. I only got one mom, and that's the one that I got, right? Thanks for stating the obvious. And I always say, but she's your mother. Yeah, but she was my mother. Like, she was supposed to be my greatest love, my biggest fan, right?
They bring you down.
Or what's that?
But they weren't. They bring you down.
Yeah. She was what I needed protection from. There's always been a big stigma, and I'm hoping that in us talking about it, aside from healing out loud, we start to turn that stigma around and just support people where they are without judging them.
I agree fully. And I think normalize being no contact, normalize healthy relationships, normalize cutting toxicity out of your life. And, I think that's one of the reasons why I went viral like I did, was because at the time, especially, and that was something I never intended. I never cared if I became social media famous or TikTok famous or anything. I literally had zero desire for that. It was fully organic. what happened was is my wife saw a video and she was like, you should stitch this. It might be cathartic for you. And I was like, okay, I'm going to stitch it. And for those of y'all who are listening who don't know what a stitch is, it's on TikTok where you take a video, you take a 5 minute or 5 second like excerpt of it, and then you so people can get the idea of what you're talking about, and then you go in and you talk about your own story. So I stitched this video and it was like, tell me, about your mother-in-law. I forget exactly what it said, but then I talked to him, well, not your mother-in-law, your mother. I did this video. I literally woke up the next day to 40,000 followers. So I kept telling these stories, and I kept telling the stories and everything that went on, and which was very healing for me to get it out. And I started to actually remember some things. I was able to start filling in some pieces, and that eventually, in a very strange way, morphed into true crime and current events. That was on the Gabby Petito case. That's not necessarily relevant, but Brian Laundrie was a narcissist. When you watch the Moab footage, you could see that. And that was kind of the thing, which I'll say this, I noticed when watching that footage, I don't know if you've ever seen that footage, he exhibited the same mannerisms, the same speech, the same actions as my mother. And that's why my wife was like, you need to watch this. And then I started covering that case, and people just like to cover true crime. Talking about all that stuff and sharing the stories, I think as a male doing it, because most of the time it's boys do not speak out against their mom. It just doesn't happen. And I think for a lot of these people, especially for women who were married to men who had mothers like this, had mother-in-laws that were like this, I think for a lot of them, it was something that vindicated them a little bit. Like, oh my gosh, I can understand this. I need to share this with my husband. I need to share this with my partner. And, at this point, one thing that I think people should know is 26% of millennials and Gen Z are no contact with a family member. For millennials, it's typically a parent, and for Gen Z, it's typically a grandparent. But 26%, that's more than that. That's a quarter of us.
Yeah, and that's the numbers we know about. And people say that it's increasing because of the internet. It's increasing because of education. It's increasing because we understand that we don't have to stay in abusive relationships. We do have permission to, and we are normalizing seeking out therapy and healthy relationships. I also kind of wonder how much it's increased, because I've been no contact for over 30 years. And back then there was no internet. And when I started speaking, sharing my story, because I lived on the streets, I ran away from home, like that, my abuse drove me out of the house in that way. A lot of people would come up to me and say, I left when I was 15. I left when I was 16. People that were almost like sort of connected to me community wise through like a Kevin Bacon 7 degrees of separation kind of thing, that nobody ever talked about it. Like everybody was in all these little compartments, but all these kids were also no contact and moving away. We just didn't have a way to know that there was a community of us and that we weren't alone. And that's one of the things that I love about the internet. And I really resent it when especially the estranged parents, I'm air quoting, out there say things like it's because of the internet. That's my first red flag. If you're blaming the internet for what's gone wrong in your relationship, you're not looking in the right direction, because it's pretty rare that somebody goes no contact without you having some idea that the relationship is going sideways.
The other thing I want to kind of add on to what you said too is, I'm guessing you're probably early Gen X. That starts in 1964, 65.
Yeah, so I'm 66, yeah.
Okay. So the thing about it too is when you talk about the baby boomer generation and Gen X in general, but especially early Gen X, there was a huge stigma about that. You couldn't say that. And a lot of the baby boomers who are, and I'll just be blunt, a lot of baby boomers are the problem now. But a lot of them came from very abusive homes too. And you have an option to perpetuate a cycle or break the cycle. A lot of them chose to perpetuate, and that's why now their kids don't want anything to do with them. But there was a huge stigma of those people, and you couldn't go out and just say. And I think that the internet is kind of helping people who are in that situation connect. But I think part of it too, a lot of it, especially, I'm an old millennial. So you were born at the very beginning of Gen X. I was born at the very beginning of the millennials. So I was born in 82. And the younger millennials and all of Gen Z, they just don't give a shit. And I have so much respect for them in that regard. Like, they just, like, people say they don't want to work, they're lazy. They just, no, They just want to be treated with respect. And if you're not going to treat them that way, if you're going to give them a toxic environment, they're just like, fuck you, we're done. And that's just it. And I kind of envy that from them because I can't do that.
They are, but I will say that they are also struggling because a big part of my client base is that age grouping, and a lot of them are either they're either low contact, no contact, or well, there's a few that might have higher contact in the beginning, but eventually they end up tapering off. And they struggle a lot with those decisions. On the one hand, they're like, I'm not going to be treated this way. I'm not going to take it anymore. And they're out. But on the flip side, it is a really devastating, as you know, as I know, and I want to make sure the listeners really get this, that it is a devastating situation to be in. You're mourning the living, you're building a family, you're having your own children. And of course, we want that love, those connections for our kids. And we're robbed of that too. We were robbed of our childhoods, and then we were robbed of being able to have those adult relationships with healthy, loving parents. And so the decision to go no contact, decision for lack of a better word, is so that we can break the cycle and we can live better lives. But there's still a sadness that comes with that, that is lifelong, for something that we're never going to have, that we have to accept. And that person has made a choice not to do better. And that is very difficult.
It is, but here's the thing about them versus, like, say, me. It took me till I was in my mid 30s. They'll do it at 18. And yeah, it doesn't make it any easier, but they value themselves enough to put their mental health and their best interests before continuing to deal with that type of toxicity and negativity in their life. Yeah, anybody who goes through this, nobody wants this. This is not what anybody wants. We would, in an ideal situation, have parents who love us and treat us well. And there's always some jealousy when you have friends or families that are like that. And they don't, yeah, I mean, they might do it sooner, but they don't take it. I don't think that they're taking it any lighter than any of us. I think that they just will do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
They'll
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 do it.
just
Yeah.
yeah, they'll just do it. And
Yeah.
yeah, they're still going to go through the same emotions that we go through, but just doing it a decade or two less than what we have.
Yeah, which means a decade or so less of trauma and more so of healing. And it also means beginning a family without that trauma after having gone to therapy, and breaking the cycle of even passing down trauma, because there's
Mhm.
abuse and then there's passing down trauma that oftentimes happens as well, right? So on the note of healing and therapy and breaking free and forging a path that is about healthy relationships, how have you thrived?
So I mean, therapy helps, right? Again, TikTok has been really cathartic. It's been, for especially in my earlier stages, and a lot of people who still follow me from the very beginning. I met a lot of people like yourself who are in the same situation that we are, and it's really nice to feel not alone in this, because you do feel so alone and isolated, and especially when there's a stigma surrounding it that you're like, I can't talk about it. And I used to really struggle with talking about it, but now I just put it out there, and I'm like, you know what? Here's my story. You don't like it? It made me TikTok famous. Oh well, whatever. It's one of those things. And I mean, as far as thriving goes, I am ADHD. I do have struggles in my life because of ADHD, but I also have a lot of wonderful things that happen because of it as well. It's a blessing and a curse. I have things that are cathartic. Like, so I like to work on cars. I have a DeLorean that calms me down to work with it. And one thing that I did recently is it'd be based on the fact that I mentioned earlier about the 26% Gen Z millennial. Is my daughter hasn't really directly asked this yet, but I know it's coming. Like, why don't we see? Because she's made comments about asking about, like, my mom. I just explained to her, it's just daddy's mom has done some things that aren't good for our family, and we don't want her to do these things to you. And so we made this decision. And that ended up leading me to write a children's book, which will be out probably spring of 24. I just got the illustrations back the other day. It's called Boundaries. And basically it talks about that exact situation. Why do we see mom's parents but not yours? And I wrote it from my perspective because I think more men need to see this. I'm hoping it's dads that will read this book to their children at night, or I know it'll probably be mostly moms, but still. there will be ones that are out there. To have this conversation, to explain it in a way that they can understand, and it talks about how sometimes people don't do things in our lives and don't treat us with the love and nurturing that we need, so we set boundaries. And it's like, well, what are boundaries? Well, boundaries are like an invisible line, and we talk about that. And then it talks about how even boundaries are important in a family, that if you tell me that you need some quiet time to play alone, then I'll respect that boundary and let you do that, give you that time. And it basically shows that there's mutual respect in a family, and that families can be built on love, and love doesn't and shouldn't have conditions.
I love that. That is awesome. And it is so needed.
It apparently does not exist. I talked to between my publisher and therapists that I've shared it with. They're like, we've looked for books like this. They don't exist. I apparently accidentally hit an untapped niche.
Yeah. And it's a really, really important one, because a lot of adult survivors out there struggle with how to have conversations. I get this question a lot, what to say to their children. And also the explaining about boundaries is so important, because we need to be teaching our children how to hold their boundaries, that they're allowed to have boundaries, and what to do when somebody is deciding that they're not going to be healthy for you. Really
Yeah.
teach at that standard at a young age. I forgot to ask you, because you mentioned your sister. So what are your relationships like with your siblings?
My half sister was somebody I was not allowed to have a relationship with. So she's about 12 years older than I am. Her and I now have a phenomenal relationship. She feels for the first time in her life that she actually has a sibling. And I really enjoy talking to her. I love her to death. She's great. She lives out in California. So she's very far from me. And so that's kind of a struggle, but we talk fairly regularly. My brother, as I mentioned earlier, has a lot of unresolved trauma. My brother is very much about himself and not really anybody else. And I think that that's trauma response. I truly do. And when I talk to him about it, he won't get into conversations about our parents. He just won't do it. He doesn't have much of a relationship with either of them outside of a very light, superficial relationship. And he doesn't really care what they think about him. So I envy him for that. I don't know the last time I talked to him. It's probably been, I don't know, 5-6 months at this point. Not that I'm not talking to him. That's just how it is. But the one thing I do want to mention and I think that this is important, and I made a video about this, and I actually think I have this one pinned. If you want to find out the truth about a narcissist, you're not the only person that not speaking to them. I guarantee you that. Call up the people who aren't speaking to them and ask to hear their side of the story. And that's what I started doing for my aunts, my uncle, one of my uncles she doesn't talk to, my grandmother, her best friend who has since passed, her former best friend. I called up and said, look, I want to hear your side of the story. And I will tell you what I've heard my entire life, but I want to hear your side of the story first. And so they would tell me. And what I found very interesting about it is the stories were very similar, except in my mom's story, she was the victim. In every single other person's story, even people who are not connected to each other in any way, shape, or form, she victimized them. And so now I have a relationship with my aunts, my grandmother, my uncle. In fact, we were trying it spring. I was supposed to hopefully in a few days go up to see him. He wanted to take me to a race, which I thought was really sweet. And because we did that when I was much younger, my grandfather was still alive. I'd go to races with him. I'm going to try to make some time to go see him. Against relationship with my grandmother, my aunts, all these people I wasn't allowed to have relationships before. Now I do, and it's wonderful. So I lost my mom, but I gained all these other people. And yeah, they're not your mom. They're not a replacement of what your mom should be, but they're great. And my Aunt Joy, one of my aunts, she's pretty much like a grandmother to Victoria as much as she can. She also takes care of my grandmother, so she's spread really thin when she can. She's always very thoughtful to Victoria, loves her to death. So that's been a blessing.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's not all about the title grandma and grandpa. It's really about the love and the adults, the people that we give ourselves and our children, and that we're lucky or fortunate enough to have. If you were, well, not if, I'm going to ask you to give the listeners a piece of wisdom or inspiration so that they can know that they're going to be okay, that they're going to get through this too, because a lot of the listeners that I have tend to be at the beginning of losing family and going no contact. What would you tell people out there that you've learned throughout this, and what is your life like? Like, what inspiration can you give them?
I'll actually share some information that was shared with me that helped me. I loved my grandfather dearly. He was apparently a shitty father. He was a wonderful grandfather. but he was a shitty dad. And he would do these things where he would just cut you off and not talk to you. The difference between him and my mother was this. My grandfather might not talk to you for 20 years, but if you called him up and said that you needed him, he would be there, no questions asked. My mom was not that way. He was a hot-headed man. Well, when he died, he was speaking to my mom and his two sons, but not his two other daughters. He passed away. And one of my biggest concerns, which I think a lot of people who go no contact, one of their concerns are what happens when they die? What happens when they die? How am I going to feel? That's a question for the last 5 years I've been asking myself. And I ask it all the time, and it does get better. And what my aunt said to me with this was he hadn't talked to me in 4 years. My grandpa, by the time when he died, she goes, I began mourning him 4 years before he died. And when he actually passed away, I knew that I did everything I could. I reached out to him. I tried to talk to him. I did everything that I could to try to make this relationship work and make it better. And here's the thing. Your listeners, people who've gone through what I went through, and even though my mom technically cut me off, knowing that probably in hopes or knowing that I would come back to her, I did everything that I could to try to make that relationship work with my wife, with my daughter, with myself. And she didn't want part of it. You can't make people do things that they don't want to do. And know that if you're at the point where you're struggling with being no contact, that it's because you care and you deserve better. And that with each passing year, it does get easier.
And on that note, thank you so much for being on But She's Your Mother, the podcast.
Thank you for having me.